The paintwork on this garden gnome is pretty worn off, so let's paint over it. I was told I could change the colors, but it's usually next to this green frog, and the old color scheme actually fits, so I decided to only make a few small changes. I started by washing it with soap and water and a sponge, because it's been outside for years and it has dust and dirt all over it. If you don't wash it, you risk the new paint chipping off. I let it dry first on its side, but then upright, standing on two pencils so any water can fall out and there'd be some airflow under it as well. Once it felt dry and not as cold anymore, because I assume it's still wet when it feels cold, I prepared it for painting by priming it with acrylic gesso. The surface was pretty uneven, some parts had paint and in some other parts the paint had completely chipped off, so priming it gives the paint an even layer to stick to. You can use normal white gesso for this or even make your own, but I decided to use clear gesso for a couple of reasons. First off, I'm not going to be changing the colors drastically, so I don't need to cover them up with white. And secondly, because my white gesso is finally running out after 8 years of using it. The issue with clear gesso is that it's difficult to know which parts you've already primed, since you can't see it. I used a big round brush to get in all the nooks and crannies, especially around the nose and the mouth. I did 2 coats of gesso and let it dry again after each one. Next, I started painting it as a kind of a paint by numbers, just filling in each area of the same color. Starting with white for the beard, the hair, eyebrows, whites of the eyes and the lantern. And red for the hat. When I was looking for tips, I did see people recommending that you use outdoor paints, but I just used my regular craft and hobby grade acrylics. So we'll see how this paint job wears outdoors over time. I have a couple of similar trials going on with stones and clay flower pots too. I continued painting at the summer cottage. Some parts, like sections of the blue shirt, definitely need 2 paint coats, but the hat, for example, only needed 1. I thought the original purple pants didn't quite work with the rest of the color palette, so after painting the black shoes, I added some white and mixed a mid-tone grey for the pants. You could use the ridges in the statue as a guide for painting highlights and shadows if you wanted to. I got some grey on the black shoes, but it was an easy fix painting some black over it and trying to be a bit more careful to get a clean edge. I thought it was best to let it dry so I wouldn't accidentally smudge more areas while I was holding and turning it around to paint it. And here's a little interlude of the gnome with his sidekick owl. I added some red and yellow to make brown for the lantern and the pipe and the eyes, some red inside the pipe and yellow for the lantern, but it turned out muddy, so I wiped it off with a wet paper towel while the paint was still wet. I added some detail by making the turned sleeves a lighter shade of blue. And I got to the part I was threading, mixing the skin tone. I guess the old color kind of looked like aging skin already, but I gave him some makeup, a bit more of an even look. It turned out a bit too pink at first, so I added more yellow and white and painted over it, but left the cheeks, the tip of the nose and earlobes pink. I fixed up the eyes with some black and brown and added white highlights to make them more lively. I'd been moving and handling the gnome so much that a little bit of paint actually already chipped off from around the shoes and places where it maybe touched a desk or something. So I fixed up those parts and added some brown freckles. I gave it about 30 hours of drying time after the final layers before sealing. The Liquitex varnish does suggest at least 72 hours though. I gave the varnish a little shake and started varnishing with a brush. No diluting with water for this varnish. Some of the brushes I tried unfortunately had some green paint residue and I got it on the Gnome, but I wiped it off with a clean, dry, hard brush right away and varnished it again with clean varnish and a clean brush. A hard brush was definitely better for getting the sealant in all the small spaces. I let it dry overnight before the second coat, but 3 hours should be enough. If you have the statue standing on a piece of paper, you can turn it by turning the paper and don't have to touch the wet statue at all. I got a lot of air bubbles, I'm not sure why, but maybe stir the varnish more gently like this instead of shaking it to get less bubbles. I don't think they affected the end result though. I thought this might turn out boring because I decided to keep the color scheme very similar to how I thought it originally looked, but I did end up making some little upgrades and adding details here and there. But how about painting on some clay flower pots to go with the garden gnome? Watch this video next. See you there!